So my name is Jonathan Gratch. I'm a professor at University of Southern California in areas of computer science and psychology. My research basically focuses on building socially intelligent machines, and particularly an area I call affective computing, which is how do we endow machines with emotion-like capacities, and then also studying how people respond to such technology. There's two ways we look at emotion in machines. One is from the human perspective, do they attribute something like emotion? So just like in the Turing test, people attribute intelligence to a machine, and we may or may not actually have intelligence. So similarly, I study to what extent do people attribute emotion to a machine, and does that affect their behavior? But in terms of actually endowing machines with something like emotion, I mean, we try to build algorithms that can recognize human emotion, that can predict how people might respond emotionally to a situation, and possibly act in a way that would seem congruent with how a human might respond in an emotional situation. But we also look at what is the social function, what is the cognitive function of emotions in humans, and would endowing machines with that function have certain benefits, even if the function is not necessarily the same way that it's implemented in people. So planes have the function of flying, but they do it in a different way of birds. Perhaps machines will have things like emotion, but we wouldn't necessarily call them emotion. Yeah, I mean, so emotion researchers emphasize different aspects of emotion. So emotion is feeling is generally, in humans, the conscious self-awareness that I'm in an emotional state. But you don't necessarily have to have the feeling to act in an angry way. In general, emotions seem to activate physiological processes that prepare us to respond to the environment in some particular way. And that could occur and probably occurs in animals without feelings, which is more the conscious experience. So in terms of machines, the behavior, I mean, we're definitely interested in making machines that behave in ways that are emotional, sometimes just because you want to make a person think this thing has emotion, but in some cases also there may be a functional benefit to behaving in a certain way. So if a robot is in a threatening environment, it may want to change its motors and power requirements in such a way so it's better able to respond to that potential threats that in some sense is acting as if it has an emotion without necessarily having one. Yeah, so part of what I do is I try, when I put on my psychological hat, is I try to explore psychological theories of emotion by basically implementing them in software and then seeing if these models work in ways that are similar to they seem to work in people. So we would, for example, and I'm what's known as an appraisal theorist. So appraisal theory is a particular theory of emotion that argues emotion arises from some evaluation of how an event relates to a person's goals. And so we use artificial intelligence techniques to instantiate that theory into a software artifact, and then we essentially run experiments where we have a person experience a situation like a game and assess what emotions they're feeling or what behaviors they're doing that are associated with emotion, like expressions or action tendencies, and then have the model play the same game and see if the model accurately predicts typical human responses. And then if that's the case, that gives us some insight that we've captured some aspect of the theory correctly. Yeah, so one question we are interested in is to what extent does physical appearance matter, or is it merely the information that's communicated? And in fact, in emotion research, there's kind of two theoretical pathways by which emotions influence people in an interpersonal context. One is sort of emotion is information. And so if you send me a text and I send a smiley face or a frowny face back, that's information about my affective state, but it has nothing to do with how I would normally show it if we're in a face-to-face interaction. And so emotion as information, it doesn't seem like it's important, the surface manifestation. I mean, it may be important for you to judge authenticity, but the information itself can be conveyed in various ways. Whereas the other way emotions seem to influence people is things like contagion, or if I show anger, you may feel fear, and that's almost more of a low-level automatic process, and that seems to probably depend more on creating a more human-like, authentic emotional reaction. And so we look at, both sort of emotion in a very abstract textual form, but also to what extent the physical body is very important in conveying that emotional content. Yeah, so some of the emotion research informs the behavior of these things called virtual humans, which are digital characters that act like people and can interact with people. And there's several potential applications. In general, we are interested in technology that has meaningful social interactions with people. And so one big application we've been considering is virtual humans that can interview people about mental health. And interestingly, part of the benefit of virtual humans in this context is actually emphasizing the extent to which they're not like people. So we don't always try to make technologies exactly like person. Sometimes we try to make technology that has some of the benefits of people, but also some of the benefits of a machine. So we build virtual humans that can interview people about potential indicators of mental health. And one of the advantages of that is that we can capture facial expressions and vocal intonation and all that, and analyze that for some signals of depression. But another advantage we found is that people actually oddly feel more comfortable talking to a machine because they don't feel the machine is judging them. So one of the issues in depression, PTSD, is that's a stigmatized illness, and so people often engage in what's called impression management. They don't want to reveal their weak. They emphasize their strengths, and but if they're in an anonymous situation, they're more comfortable disclosing. On the other hand, what's advantage about a person is a person can establish rapport and help draw somebody out. And so there's kind of two lines of research related to disclosure. One is you can get people to disclose more if they fill out an anonymous computer web form. Another line says you can get people to disclose more if you establish rapport, but now by a virtual human we can have something that in some sense can establish rapport because you have a character that can show active listening and follow-up questions and so forth. Yet on the other hand, it can emphasize, hey, I'm just a computer program, I'm not here to judge you, and people believe they're not being judged because it's just a computer program. And so we find actually people disclose more to these virtual characters than either a web form or talking to another person. So in general, I mean, one thing we find is that people treat machines somewhat like people, but not very much. So it's interesting, take any social science phenomena, you'll see that you can find an example of a person treating a machine as if it was a person. So machines that are a different race, people will be meaner to in some sense. But there's a big gap, and increasingly the way we've been looking at it is in terms of a psychological theory called mind perception theory, which argues that when we interact with others, we attribute some capacities to their mind. Do they have the ability to think? Do they have free will? Do they have the ability to feel? Do they suffer? And what we generally find is that when you're interacting with a machine, you're increasingly willing to ascribe intelligence, agency, sophistication, reasoning to it, particularly if it looks and acts like a smart, Spock-like machine. But generally, people don't ascribe emotion, feeling to machines, and that alters the way that they interact with them. It's when you put that in a human context, is as if they're mechanistically dehumanizing another person would be how they're treating a machine. But then we also find that if you can convince this person that this machine feels, whether it shows emotion in the interaction, then it starts shifting their mental attributions, so now they think it has both agency and emotion, and now they start treating it more like a person. So in a sense, emotion seems to be a very important lever to the extent you can endow a machine with something like emotion, it'll get people to treat it much more socially, for good or ill. Yeah, so you could imagine a machine, you could build a psychopath. So a machine that perfectly conveyed when it needed to that it felt pain and suffering, but of course it didn't feel pain and suffering. And so you could imagine such a thing, just as you can imagine a human being like that. And I think, we would, when that is quote unquote found out, probably treat both the psychopath and the psychopathic robot in a similar way, put them off somewhere. And we have the advantage, I guess, with the robot, we can actually look inside the head, right, and see, is it, does these things matter? But ultimately, I think, the reason, emotion is, to the extent that emotion is authentic in people, it's tied intimately to these bodily processes which are related to energy mobilization, action readiness, and I think to the extent that a machine, quote unquote, really had emotion, it would serve the same function. So that machine would have to solve these problems of acting in an uncertain world with limited power resources, and it will have to warm up certain motors and turn off certain things depending on the nature of the environment, whether it's safe or threatening. And so once you start talking about that level of tight coupling between mind and quote unquote body, I think that's what I would mean by something having emotion in there. I think the distinction becomes, of whether it's true or not, becomes less meaningful. But yes, you can imagine a disembodied, good old-fashioned AI that the motion didn't really serve any real function for the organism other than to purely manipulate the other people. And in that case, I would not ascribe emotion to that type of artifact. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of benefit. I mean, human emotion is an important signal. It's something we try to maximize in societies and individuals. And so if a machine doesn't understand and respond to a person's emotion, it's not going to be, I think it limits the potential benefits of this machine. So having a machine that can try to help motivate you to exercise more is really, in some sense, an emotional process. Understanding frustration, boredom in an educational setting. People try to build machines that recognize this child is frustrated and adjust automatically the instructional content to try to, or also technology to help humans better regulate their own emotions. Detecting suicidality and Facebook posts. There's a lot of potential benefits to making algorithms able to understand, simulate, predict, model the role emotion plays in human activity and health, and so I think those benefits are what's driving the field largely. Yeah, there's a lot of potential concerns about the technology, and I think a lot of it probably, well, several concerns. The biggest one, I think, is that people feel that this technology can be manipulative. Just like advertising manipulates our emotions to get us to buy certain products, politicians manipulate our emotions to get votes. You could easily imagine with enough sophistication, we could have these super sophisticated machines that know how to push human buttons and persuade us to do stuff, which may or may not be aligned with our interests. So in general, I think that's one example of a more general phenomena where how do we ensure technology is congruent with human desire, goals, interests. There's, I think, some concern, I'm less concerned about this, that if machines, quote unquote, portray that they have emotion, it could change the way we interact with them in destructive ways. So imagine, computer games. You have these emotional characters that are you're torturing, toys. You're torturing. There's some concern that kids are torturing Alexa. Does that lead us to then think it's okay to treat humans in a less empathetic way? That's a phenomenon sometimes called moral disengagement. So that we learn to morally disengage from others, and that technology affords us to explore doing harmful things to seemingly emotional artifacts. Yes, I guess the main, in both traditional AI and what I do, we're interested in developing algorithms that optimize some objective function. I think, I'm more interested in trying to understand to what extent human solutions to certain problems could be of benefit to machines. And so I think traditionally AI has kind of grown out of rationality, logic, prescriptive models of how to solve problems. And humans tend not to follow those models, and so one view is, well, the humans need to be taught better or corrected. Another perspective is, well, maybe there's something missing from that rational conceptualization that could be benefited by adding in. And so some of my interest, and kind of aligns more with behavioral economics, is trying to understand to what extent people behave in ways that seem irrational, and perhaps and many of those are attributed to emotion-like processes, and to what extent might that actually benefit a machine if it actually had those human-like characteristics. And in general, I guess my research, I keep flipping back and forth between building algorithms, but then studying how people respond to these algorithms, which is more psychology, and so that somehow distorts and twists my research in a way that's different than if I was just purely focused on developing algorithms. I guess one potential implication of the work is it changes people's conception of what it is to be human, I suppose. So, in the past, humans were seen as, unique because we had intelligence. And over time, we lose to Go, we lose to Watson. People are kind of, oh yeah, machines are intelligent, but by God, we have emotion. And there's actually an interesting study where after the AlphaGo thing, someone ran a survey where the importance of emotion and human identity went up after that survey. And in some sense, I think if machines have emotion, that will cause a threat, reevaluation of of human uniqueness. I think throughout the history of science, going back to Darwin, science has led us to reconceptualize man's relationship to nature, and so I think one potential implication of emotional machines is will influence the extent to which we see having emotion as something that's uniquely human. But I think it also just, I'm more interested in, as we, I think understanding things is kind of, to create something that can think and can feel, but yet we understand in some sense how it works, I think, reveals a lot about ourselves and allows us to introspect more on what it means to be human in a different way than, you know, our folk theories that we've grown up with. But yeah, I don't have great answers to those questions. But
that is a great answer.
Okay.